Hi, and welcome to Police Stories Podcast. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force. Hope you've been enjoying it so far. If this is your first time, welcome. You might want to go back to the beginning, but you can obviously dip in and out to the various episodes as they interest you or not, as the case may be. Thanks very much for the downloads again. Very good. Some good comments and some more nice people buying me coffee. Thank you very much. So today, this is episode 64. We're going to get on to something which without a doubt was the biggest incident I ever dealt with in my career. This is the one every cop has one that they really remember. And in fact, I've probably got 4 or 5, but this is the one that absolutely stands out. We'll talk about this in more detail later, but this is the one for sure that gave me a number of sleepless nights and worse. So bear with me a little bit on this one because sometimes it's difficult to talk about, as you'll probably hear as we go through, but let's see how we get on. So we're going to take you back to 22nd of March 2017. I was on the Met Police dive team, and as we talked about in previous episodes, we also did confined space searches, so searchings of sewers and various other unpleasant places, quite often sort of security searches prior to any VIP, Prime Minister, member of the royal family or someone attending a venue. We would do those, and that's what we've been doing on this day. Me and the team had been out and we'd done a very early start along Whitehall and searched all the sewers along there. So I think we started at maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, something like that. So we were finishing early because we'd obviously started so early. We got back to the base back at Wapping, and by kind of 1 o'clock ish, people were starting to drift away. The rest of the team was starting to go off, and at around about by about 2:30 there was just me and the sergeant left. I think he was doing some paperwork, I was doing, I'm not sure, whatever, in the office, and I was just getting ready to leave myself. I was about to step out the door. We're all really, really tired, because we'd had such a long day, and particularly, as I say, that early start. And Sergeant came down and found me and said, there's just been a strange call up at Westminster Bridge. He said apparently there's some sort of an RTA, which is a road traffic accident, a crash in a car crash, RTCs, I think they're called now, various acronyms depending on where you work and live. He said, there's just been an RTA up at Westminster Bridge. It's all very confusing at the moment, but there's possibly a car gone into the River Thames off the bridge, might be a dive job. I'm just going to jump in a boat and head out there and have a look, with a couple of the guys. Do you want to come up with me? And I said, yeah, sure, we'll go and see what that's all about. It seemed a bit strange. And that was just, the first call at that point. So we started heading up the river flat out, as we talked before. That's kind of in the duty boats, the Targas that the Marine unit has. That's at, 40 plus knots. Hammering up with the blues and twos on, but we were listening to the radio messages that were coming in as we were heading up the river, and they were getting more and more confusing and garbled, but it became quite apparent that something fairly big was happening up at Westminster Bridge. En route, we had all sorts of strange messages. The next one was that we were now almost up at the at Waterloo Bridge, and we were near the lifeboat pier, which is just situated there. And there was a message that came through on the radio saying that a female police officer had been shot and she had ended up in the river. Now, utterly confusing really, because, so far away from the original call, no one really knew what was going on, but obviously we weren't going to sort of worry about that at this point. We just needed to get this person out of the river. So we were asked to have a look, for this female in the river. And very quickly, one of the fire boat was helping out, the fire brigade boat that was based up on the river as well. They were nearby and were searching, and as was us. And also, I think a river cruises boat, a sort of passenger cruises boat taking tourists, had actually come across her first. And between them and the fire boat, they'd managed to get her out of the water. We had, I think, 4 cops on our boat, which was 1 extra than you would normally carry. We would normally have a minimum of 3, but the 2 of us had jumped on with 2 of the guys from the sort of the boat team, as the dive team, as I think I've explained before, was slightly separate. And we basically, she was recovered, didn't appear to have any gunshot injuries, but was clearly very badly injured. She was recovered onto the fireboat, and one of the cops on our boat jumped off and went on with the fireboat, and then they took her to the waiting ambulance, which was very nearby at the lifeboat pier, and that's a fairly standard thing for someone that ends up in the river. Now, a continuity officer, which is what that cop was, is someone who would then go with the victim to the hospital, just in case they were to sort of say anything en route about what happened. Still very confusing at this point. There was another call on the radio at this point of shots fired. And bearing in mind this had started off as an accident as far as we knew, so it was becoming very confusing, but we were still making best speed, and there was a lot of garbled messages coming off of the bridge across the river, a lot of static going on, sort of the messages were breaking, they were clipping, so we were only getting partial messages. And one of the things that was put up was that there was a number of casualties on the bridge, and the actual number again clipped, and all we caught was 4 casualties, but we were pretty confident there was a number in front of it. So I grabbed the radio and said, can we just have confirmation? Can I just confirm, was that 4 casualties on the bridge? And they came back, somebody from the bridge, and said, no, 24 casualties on the bridge. Well, that is a lot of casualties, and it was clear something, very strange was going on here, much bigger than we anticipated, and probably not at all what the initial call was. And it just shows, doesn't it, with all these multiple messages coming in, how confusing things can be at the start of an incident. It's also interesting that we could hear very much in those people's voices that were on the bridge that were giving us the radio message. You could hear the adrenaline and that slight quiver in their voice. When someone's really got the adrenaline, they're kind of, you can hear it in their voice. They're sort of excitable almost. And we all suffer it, because it's a natural reaction to something happening. So we continued to head up to the bridge. Now, on the boats, we carried something called, it's another classic police acronym, a MAFIC bag. Silly name, good idea. Basically a very large rucksack that carried 25 mini first aid kits. And I think MAFIC stands for something like, it might be MIFIC actually, because it's mass injury first aid kit or something like that. But yeah, it's basically multiple smaller first aid kits within a bag. And when we'd started having terrorist attacks in London, lots of these bags and sort of first aid supplies had been placed all around London into different places, particularly sort of transport hubs, for just the scenario where there may be, a mass casualty. And we're very lucky in London, you've got instant access to a lot of sort of, first aid type people, whether that's paramedics, doctors, nurses, whatever, and kit. But clearly, with those sort of feared terrorist incidents that are going to involve a lot of people, you need a lot of resources on scene very quickly to start dealing with them. And these kits are quite detailed. They had things that are called like Israeli bandages on, so they're big bandages, but they have like built-in tourniquets, some of them, and they have the ability for somebody to put it on themselves if they had a serious injury. And all the things in those little first aid kits had sort of very basic images on the back that anyone having never seen, for example, an Israeli bandage could look at that bandage and instantly know how to wrap that around their arm, and then use this tourniquet to apply pressure to it as well. Really good idea. We also carried on board, and this was generally for people that have been in the river, we had 3 oxygen cylinders and the full kit to set them up for people. So basically I said to the sergeant and to the other guys on the boat, look, drop me off on Westminster Pier, I'll nip up on the bridge, see what's going on, and I'll take the MAFIC bag and I'll take the oxygen, because it sounds like there's a few casualties up there. So that was agreed that just I would get off, and that would leave that crew of 3 on the boat still, which is what needed really. But again, it still wasn't really clear what was happening. So I stepped off onto the bridge, I got off our boat, we came alongside, I had the MAFIC bag, which is big and heavy, on my back. I had the 3 oxygen cylinders, which are also quite heavy. So I kind of, wobbled off the boat, barely able to stand. And there's some steps that immediately run up the side of, from Westminster Pier up onto the bridge itself, about, 15 or 20 steps. And I got to the bottom of those steps and I very clearly heard gunshots. and I heard across on the radio on an earpiece, shots fired. It wasn't clear who from, who at, who was injured. Was that police? Was that, a bad guy? We didn't really know. But obviously this was getting more and more serious by the minute. So I continued up the bridge. And I remember when I was relatively fit then, but I was carrying a lot of weight. And by the time I got to the top of the steps, bearing in mind now, for me, the adrenaline was really pumping, having just heard these shots. I was really feeling a bit sort of adrenaline, a bit shaky at the top there. I was certainly puffing by the time I got to the top of the steps there. And what I saw on the bridge stretched out was something that I'll never forget. Utter chaos is the only way you can describe it. Multiple casualties. It later turned out there was over 50 casualties. And there were some members of the public that had been there trying to help with people. There was a lot of kind of crying and screaming and moaning, from casualties. To all the world, it looked like, an exercise. It was something that I'd done loads of times in my service. And, all these, they always got, actors in that played these people and really hammed up the casualties, and they were dressed up and had pretend bandages and fake blood splattered on them, all that. That's what it looked like, basically. But unfortunately it was real. So I made my way onto the bridge. There was a London bus, a red bus, that was kind of stopped in the middle of the road with no one around it. There was these little pockets of casualties laying around, and I unzipped the Mafic bag and started passing out some basic first aid kits. Now, nobody had any sort of first aid at that point, no bandages, no nothing. So I passed out what I could, and I said to people, just look in the bags, it'll explain what's in there, and left them to it and moved on. In these scenarios, we're always trained, it's about triaging. You have to very quickly figure out who are the most seriously injured and deal with them first, because you don't want to deal with a person who's got a little cut pinky finger when you've got someone having a cardiac arrest just around the corner. So the first people on the scene of an incident like this, very much it's about seeing what's going on, assessing it as quickly as you can, feeding it back on the radio so that you can get more resources there. If needs be, declaring it a major incident, which this clearly was, but I knew it had already been declared a major incident, but because of the sheer volume of resources that were already there and what was happening. And don't forget, there was some CCTV as well, so controllers from the radio were seeing what was happening. So were some of the big bosses, no doubt, and realising this is big, and so it continued on. So I walked over to this bus, and I could see a female trapped underneath the bus, underneath the wheels of a bus, and I could see sort of from her lower back down to her feet. It was all that was sticking out of the bus. And I was a little bit stopped in my tracks for a second, because one thing we're used to dealing with as police officers or emergency services generally that go to these sort of frontline things, you turn up at an accident, invariably you're not the first one there. You might be, but quite often there's people already there. So you'll have ambulance crew, paramedic, maybe a specialist HEMS doctor that's flown in on a helicopter or something, dealing with serious casualties. There'll be lots of people around. There'll be oxygen masks, there'll be, drips running into people, and loads of people helping and doing things. When I got to this woman, there was none of that. There was just her and me on the bridge, or so it seemed at that point, what I was focused on. And I was looking around, and it was just so weird, because we're so used to somebody being there doing something. I realised maybe I'm the first person here. I need to assess her quickly. Now, obviously, I'm not a doctor. I have some basic first aid training, and I've dealt with quite a bit of sort of death and destruction, as we've talked about many times. But I got down on my hands and knees and looked at her. I sort of touched her briefly, and just from her colour and how she was, I was pretty confident she was dead, but you're kind of looking around for someone to reassure you and go, no, she's dead, let's move on. Now, everything in me was telling me she's dead, move on. But a bit of me was thinking, do I drag her out and start CPR? I don't know. And I kind of, there was a bit of hesitation from my point of view. Again, I was looking around, and I could see some people coming onto the bridge to help, but no one near me at all. And I just thought, I've got to make a decision. I am confident she's dead, and I'm going to leave her and move on, because that's what triage says. Unpleasant as it is, you can't do anything for the dead. So I stood up, I walked away from the bus, and I could see another older male lying behind me on the pavement. Again, no one with him, totally by himself. His eyes were partially open, but his eyes were kind of rolled to the back of his head. You could see the whites of his eyes, but he was completely still and had that real deathly colour about him. And I went over, and the same thing. I touched him briefly. He was already going cold, and I was looking around thinking, I'm pretty sure he's dead as well. And the enormity of this situation was starting to hit me, but it's all coming at a million miles an hour. So it's not like you can stop there and have a cup of tea and sit down and give it a right good thinking about. I knew that I had to react pretty quickly. So again, I look round, there's still no one with me to sort of guide me medically that he's dead, leave him. But I absolutely felt that was the thing to do, the same as I had for the poor woman under the bus, So I moved on and I made my way across the bridge, further across the bridge, closer to St Thomas's Hospital, away from Westminster Palace. And as I walked over, the same thing, there was pockets of casualties, that were laying down, some by themselves, some with, a couple of people helping them or reassuring them or doing anything. And the same thing, I basically just passed out my little first aid kits to everyone I found until I got to the far side of the bridge. And I was almost sort of level with St Thomas's Hospital, which is, as I say, the opposite side of the river to Westminster Palace and to Parliament. And I was looking round thinking, whatever's happened, I don't think it goes beyond here. I couldn't see any casualties beyond here. So I thought, I've done kind of what I can here. I was getting low on first aid stuff. So I turned around and I made my way back. And as I walked back across the bridge, there was still nobody with my 2 fatalities. But I was confident, they'd not moved or anything. So I was confident I was right in my call on those. Carried on across. And the casualties seemed to get more serious as I, there was kind of walking wounded on one side where I'd been. And as I got closer to Parliament, they became more and more serious. I could see a lot of blood and more sort of, screams from the casualties. I could see there was a male lying on the floor, and I could only see his bottom end from sort of almost his knees down because he had 2 or 3 people around him helping him. And in fact, somebody had set up oxygen for him. I remember seeing the oxygen cylinder, and I could see him from the knees down, as I said, and I could see he had black trousers on, and he had a specific type of trouser on that I recognised. I was pretty confident it was a job pair of trousers. He was in the police. I thought this was another officer, but there was 2 or 3 people very much involved with helping him, so I didn't, feel the need to get involved. But I did just check the cylinder. All the oxygen cylinders have a gauge on them to tell you if they're full or not. And now there was a member of medical staff helping him. He was not moving. His legs looked at a horrible angle. They were kind of splayed out, going in different directions. He clearly had some bad sort of leg injuries, and there was a decent pool of blood under him as well that was kind of slowly filling up. So I knew he was serious. And I checked the oxygen cylinder. It was very low. It was almost empty, and it was the same type that I had. So I said to the medical guy there, look, you're almost out of oxygen. I've got 3 here. I'm going to swap this one out for a full one. And he said, thanks. So I quickly did what I needed to do there and swapped those cylinders over. And then I moved on and I found another serious casualty again with people with them helping. Now, they didn't have oxygen. So from scratch, I set up my oxygen cylinder with a mask and said, why don't you put this on them? And then again, found a third one a little bit further on who was very similar and set her up also with oxygen. So by now, I'd now used up all my first aid kits and my oxygen cylinders. So I was pretty much out, and people were now starting to trickle on the bridge. And when I look back across to St Thomas's Hospital again, it was a fantastic sight, one that I'll never forget. It was like something off a film. There was a line of medical staff. I'm not sure that it was porters, doctors, nurses, paramedics, whoever it was. The messages had obviously got through to the hospital that there's been a lot of casualties on the bridge and they need help. And there must have been 30 odd medical staff all running towards us to help, and basically stopping and going to each of the casualties in turn and sort of doing their bit, which was fantastic to see. And it was a huge relief because it took a lot of pressure off me for sure, in that I was thinking, I'm way out my depth here medically, so I'm just really glad there's someone here to sort of take over on that front. So I started to walk away from the bridge more towards to Parliament, and I could see that there was what I knew to be a plain police vehicle, an unmarked police vehicle, no sirens or it wasn't marked up with a police car. It was just a plain car to anyone that didn't know it, but I recognised it as a police vehicle. And there was a very, very ashen-faced officer, armed officer, standing next to it, and he was looking in utter shock. If you had to describe someone in shock, that was him. And he had a firearm on him, a long gun as we call it, and it was in the low slung position, so he was sort of holding it as he should, but sort of down away from himself. And I went up and I said to him, "You all right, pal?" And he said, "No, not really." And I said, "What's happened?" And he said, "This guy's driven across the bridge, and he's been hitting people as he's gone." And I looked down further towards Parliament. I could see this SUV, I think it was a Hyundai Tucson, and it was crashed into the wall at the side of Parliament. And he'd explained that, he'd been sat in this car every now and then. There's various armed patrols all the time around this area, sometimes uniform and marked, sometimes in plain cars and plain clothes. He was uniformed, but he was in a plain car, and he was sat up there kind of minding his own business, as he'd done many times before, when this Hyundai Tucson came flying by him. We now know that this vehicle reached up to 76 miles an hour as part of this attack, and then crashed in front of him. And as it went past him, he was aware of noises behind him. But bear in mind, this all happened in split seconds. The entire attack took something like 80 seconds. It was ridiculous from start to finish. It was over. So this guy had, no time at all to react. He managed to step out of his car as that vehicle was about to crash. And he said, "I was trying to process it. I was trying to decide, is this some sort of an attack? Do I need to start shooting into this vehicle or what?" And he said, by the time I'd had that thought for a nanosecond, it had crashed and the guy was out and running. But I said to him, "But how could you?" I tried to sort of reason with him. And of course, he was in bits at that point. But I was saying, how can you possibly have thought that? Because how did you know it wasn't somebody that had a heart attack and that had fallen onto the accelerator and accelerated across the bridge? Can you imagine if you'd have got out and started firing shots at this car, and you didn't really know where it had come from, what it was doing? It just wasn't clear at that point. And equally, Westminster is full of tourists. Imagine if you'd have fired shots at it, done nothing to the car at all, of somebody who might have had this, this heart attack or some sort of medical episode. And also now all the shots you just fired at him have continued on down and hit a number of tourists. So I said, you could not have done anything more. And I said to him, just wait there and just chill out. You've done absolutely everything you needed to do. I was really trying to, sort of, not calm him down, but, help him out. And there was a uniformed sergeant nearby. He wasn't armed, but I said to him, "You just wait there." Sorry, this is back to the armed guy. And I wandered across this sergeant. I said, "Look, I'm not armed now. I used to be. The guy over there who's carrying, I'm telling you now, he's in shock. He should not be carrying that weapon anymore. He needs someone, ideally an armed officer, to relieve him of that weapon and for him to have a sit down and be taken away from the scene, because he's really struggling, And in fact, very shortly after that, I think another armed sergeant turned up, and I know they went over to this guy and, settled him down, took his weapon off him, and he was taken away. But he was really, cut up and already blaming himself. I dread to think how, going forward, he dealt with it. Well, I mean, we now know, if we talk about the attack, what happened. Basically, a guy called Khalid Masood had got in this car, this Hyundai Tucson, and he drove from one side of the bridge to the other at 76 miles an hour, hitting as many people as he could on the way over. In the region of 50 people he hit, some of whom he knocked into the river by the force of the impact, and that was the first female that we fished out of the river. She wasn't killed initially. She was knocked into the river with very bad injuries. We recovered her in the boats, as we talked about at the beginning. And then subsequently, a few days later, she died. He then continued on driving across the bridge, and he turned and crashed into the wall. He then got out and ran round to Parliament, where he was met by one of the unarmed police officers, Keith Palmer. He had a very large knife on him, and he then stabbed poor Keith Palmer, the PC, to death before anyone could help him. Again, this thing was so quick. And what had happened was the Foreign Secretary was at Parliament at the time, and he had an armed protection team with him, a close protection team, a Met Police team. They saw what was happening and came over and fired 3 shots at Khalid, the attacker, and killed him. They were the shots that I'd heard when I stepped off the boat. And obviously all the paramedics started to work on both of them. You know, there was no favouritism, both Keith, the police officer, and also Khalid, you know, the offender. And in fact, there's a photo that's, for me, quite haunting, but also has a lot of respect in it, of the MP, Member of Parliament, Tobias Ellwood, carrying out CPR on Keith Palmer, trying to do his bit. Now, Tobias is ex-military, I believe. I think he was a military officer, so, you know, perhaps switched into that role again. But by all accounts, he nigh on had to be dragged off when, you know, medical staff at the scene had already called it and said there's nothing more can be done for Keith, he's dead. You know, Tobias refused to give up and virtually had to be physically dragged off him to stop him. So I have to say, you know, huge respect to him for that. Also in the boot of that car was what looked like a bomb, an IED, an improvised explosive device. So when they opened the boot of that vehicle that he crashed into the side of the building, that took a lot longer to deal with as well, because there was a suspected bomb in there. At this point, I didn't know any of this was going on around the corner, and bearing in mind I had used up all of my resources in terms of first aid, so I got back on. Called up my boat, I went back down onto the Westminster Bridge Pier and was picked up by the boat, and then spent some hours on the boat. Basically, we closed off the river, and we were, you know, checking that no one else had been knocked into the river. There was by now 3 or 4 police boats out there, and we stayed out there for some hours. One thing I did do, the second I got back on the boat, was text my wife. Now, at this point, virtually all of the mobile phone providers and carriers had crashed in the area, because can you imagine how many thousands of people are either ringing or texting loved ones to say they're okay, or perhaps trying to ring or text loved ones to say, are you okay? You know, and in fact, that's exactly what I did. I got in, because I was there very early on before they crashed, sent a very quick text to my wife just to say, look, whatever you see on the telly or the news, don't worry, I'm okay. I'll speak to you later. And that was it. And then we carried on the boat, and there was various debris in the river as well, which we picked out. And ironically, there was a sort of what looked like a picture frame floating along the river. So we went to pick it up, and it was a commendation. It was a bravery award, I believe, or some sort of an award for a police officer. And what I later found out was the police officer that I said thought I'd seen up on the bridge, you know, that had you know, very bad leg injuries and ultimately ended up in a wheelchair, I believe. He had been at some sort of award ceremony across the river and was walking back across the bridge when he was hit by the car, and it knocked his award that he was carrying under his arm into the river, and then, you know, caused those terrible injuries to him. So that was, you know, pretty poignant moment getting that as well. I'm glad he survived. So yeah, we continued on really. I mean, from my point of view, that was it with the incident dealt with. At the end of the day, we went back. Obviously, it grew huge. You know, hundreds, if not thousands, of officers and people involved. We headed back to the base after a good few hours. We were absolutely knackered at this point because we'd been on the go since 2 or 3 in the morning, and I kind of went home basically. And that was that. Now, at the time, it didn't really cause me any issues dealing with this incident. And I think the following day, I kind of got a pat on the back and a cup of tea and well done, Dave, and that was it. I wasn't looking for anything else because there was lots of other people there that did things as well. And that was that. And I had no real issues, and everything continued on. And then 12 months later, when it was the 1st year anniversary of the Westminster Bridge, you know, terror attack, it was all over the news again. It was all on, you know, on the telly. It was all the footage and everything there. And I kind of watched it and didn't think much of it. But that night, when I tried to go to sleep, I was really struggling. You know, it was it was all coming back. I was having all sorts of unpleasant flashbacks. I was sweating like you wouldn't believe, just lying in bed. But weirdly, particularly the soles of my feet, it felt like they were absolutely gushing sort of sweat. Really unpleasant, I know, but that's how it sort of manifested itself in me, and I could not sleep. And I had 2 weeks of this. A year later, I just couldn't sleep. I just felt awful. And in the end, my wife had picked me up one day for work, and I said to her, I'm at the end of my tether here, and I'd burst into tears and said, I don't know what to do. I just can't sleep. And she was saying, well, you're going to have to tell someone and seek some sort of professional help, So being in a very sort of manly world, I didn't want to admit to any issues, and later on sort of fessed up to one of my bosses that I was struggling a bit. Perhaps didn't get the best response, and not a lot happened. And I was pretty much told that if there was an issue, I was going to be off the team, and to sort of not quite pull myself together, but that was the intimation. And whether that was what I needed or whatever, but thankfully from that day forward, I had no more issues, and it just got better by itself. I suddenly could sleep, and the sweating stopped, and the thinking about it stopped, and everything just went back to normal pretty much. So that was all good, and I thought that I've cracked this. I'm okay. But amazingly, some 6 years later, when I was working in Scotland, and again we're going to get to that in a few episodes' time, I was working within counter-terrorism myself, and people knew that I'd been on Westminster Bridge on the day, and I was asked to give a little input about what had happened. And they put on this video first about terrorism, and it was to a number of sort of council leaders, and there were some police officers there and various other emergency services. They showed this video, which showed a lot of the footage again, and it was set to the song Sound of Silence, which is quite a hard-hitting song as well. And everyone in the room was a little bit choked up because it was a really unpleasant video. And I was thinking, I'll be okay as long as I'm not immediately asked to give this talk, as long as there's 10 minutes of waffle before they say, can you just talk about it? But literally as soon as the video finished, they said to me, right, do you want to just stand up and give us this input then? So I was like, sure, no problem. Stood up, turned around, there's about 50, 60 people there, started telling the same story as I am today, and barely got into it before I broke down into a big blubbery mess, basically, and felt a complete idiot. And I didn't quite have to be dragged off the stage. I tried to get through it, but I did finish it, albeit through choking back tears. But, needless to say, clearly it wasn't sorted and there was an issue, but I buried it for 6 years without realising. And what happened was one of my inspectors took me to one side afterwards and said, look, clearly this is unresolved for you. We need to get you some professional help. So I'd had perhaps the response that I should have had all those years before. And ultimately I went on to do counselling my final year in the police, and had sort of 12 sessions of counselling, all based around this incident and some others, because, as I say, there's probably about 4 for me that really hit hard, but that one particularly is the one that stands out. And I have to say it was very good and helped massively. I wasn't sure how I was going to get on talking about this one today, but actually seemingly it feels okay, so never going to forget it for sure. Massive incident for me, and probably for anyone, quite frankly. But yeah, the counselling did the trick, definitely, or at least I hope it did. Hopefully it's not going to come back now. We'll see. I'll tell you next week. But no, I think we'll be okay. So hope you found that interesting. Keep going back for some more. Probably never quite as big as that, but still got some interesting ones, I hope. And I'll speak to you again next week. Take it easy. Cheers. Bye.